The first thing Stella Hale noticed about Calvin Easton was not his broad shoulders, not the weathered leather of his coat, and not the way his dark hat sat low over his eyes like he was trying to disappear into the shadow of its brim. It was the way he stood at the edge of the crowded Harlan Creek General Store and looked at nothing, the way a man looks at nothing when he is really looking at everything he has lost. Harlan Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, was not the kind of town that paid attention to grief. It was a town that paid attention to cattle prices, to whether the rains were coming, to whether the rumors about the railroad pushing west were true this year or still just rumors. It was a working town, a practical town, and the people in it moved with the kind of purpose that left very little room for standing still. But Calvin Easton was standing still. He stood with his hat in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other, and the paper was shaking very slightly, though there was no wind inside the store, and the morning was warm. He was a tall man, somewhere past 30 but not yet broken by it, with dark hair that touched the back of his collar and a jaw that held 3 days of scruff like it belonged there. He looked like a man who had once been very easy in his own body and had recently had to relearn how to live inside it. Stella saw all of that in the span of about 4 seconds, which was how long it took her to cross from the bolt fabric section to the counter with the glass jars of hard candy she had come in for, on account of it being her niece Ruth's birthday tomorrow, and Ruth had specifically asked for the cherry ones. She did not stare. Stella Hale had been raised not to stare, but she noticed. She was 26 years old, with chestnut hair she kept in a loose braid that always seemed to have strands escaping it, and brown eyes that her mother had always called too direct for a woman. She had been teaching at the one-room schoolhouse on the east edge of Harlan Creek for 3 years, ever since returning from Abilene, where she had gone to study, and where she had also briefly been engaged to a man named Thomas Whitfield, before learning that Thomas Whitfield had a wife already in Memphis. That experience had sharpened something in Stella that she had not known needed sharpening, a particular kind of clarity about people, about what they were actually carrying versus what they chose to show. She paid for the cherry candies. She tucked them into the small basket she carried. She turned to leave. The man with the shaking paper was now at the counter, asking Joe Hartwell, who ran the store, about a property on the South Road. "The Darby place," Joe was saying, scratching the back of his neck. "That old spread. It's been empty going on 2 years now. You the new buyer?" "I am," the man said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had been trained not to give too much away. "Calvin Easton. I sent the deposit through the land office in Fort Worth last month." "Well, welcome to Harlan Creek, Mr. Easton." Joe stuck out a hand. "You'll have your work cut out for you. Place needs a fair amount of work." "I know," Calvin said, and there was something in those 2 words that made Stella pause near the door, not the words themselves but the weight behind them. The quiet acceptance of difficulty, the absence of complaint, the way a man sounds when he has already made peace with hard things because harder things have already happened. She went home. She did not think about Calvin Easton for the rest of that morning, because she was a practical woman, and she had 12 students arriving at 8 o'clock, and a lesson on long division that needed her full attention. She thought about him again briefly at noon, when she was eating her lunch on the schoolhouse steps and watching the South Road, and she told herself that was not specifically about him, but about the general direction of the wind, which was not convincing even to herself. The Darby place was 3 miles south of town, set back from the road behind 2 large live oaks that had grown so close together over the years that their trunks had nearly merged. It had been empty since old man Darby had gone to live with his daughter in San Antonio, and the fields had gone to grass, and the barn roof had developed a lean that people in town mentioned with the kind of casual expertise that comes from having observed something deteriorate from a comfortable distance. Stella learned over the next few weeks that Calvin Easton had come to Harlan Creek from somewhere east of the Colorado River, though nobody seemed to know exactly where. He had bought the Darby property outright, which meant he had money, or had had money, or had come into money in a way nobody was quite sure about. He had hired 2 men from town, brothers named Pete and Dennis Lord, to help him repair the barn and clear the east field. He came into the general store on Tuesdays and Thursdays for supplies. He spoke to people politely, answered questions with the minimum number of words necessary, and never once volunteered anything about himself. Della Hopper, who was 48 and had been the primary social historian of Harlan Creek for the better part of 2 decades, told Stella over the back fence one afternoon that Calvin Easton was a widower. "How do you know?" Stella asked. "Because Ruth Alderman's husband Jim does the mail, and there was a letter addressed to a Mr. Calvin Easton with a note on the envelope that said return to sender, addressee deceased Mrs. A. Easton." Della shook her head. "He sent it to himself. Can you imagine? A letter to his own wife that he knew was not going to be answered. Some people say that's morbid. I say it's the saddest thing I've ever heard." Stella did not say anything for a moment. The spring afternoon sat around them, lazy and gold, and somewhere down the road a horse was being shod and the rhythm of it rang out in steady, patient strikes. "When?" she said finally. "Jim thinks it was recent. The envelope had a date from last fall." Last fall. So he had lost her last fall, and by spring he had bought a new property 3 states over and was rebuilding a barn with his hands because there was nothing else to do with grief except put it somewhere, and he had chosen to put it in the ground, in work, in a place that would demand everything he had left. Stella understood that. She did not say she understood it. She just filed it very carefully away in the part of herself that was learning to be gentle with people who had not asked for her gentleness. The first time she properly spoke to Calvin Easton was on a Thursday in late April, which was almost a full month after she had first seen him in the store. She had gone to Joe Hartwell's to pick up a new primer she had ordered for the school, and Calvin was there at the same time, loading bags of seed corn into the back of a wagon. He dropped one. The seam split. Corn scattered across the wooden planks of the store's side porch in a golden flood, rolling into the cracks, bouncing off the steps, and Calvin crouched down immediately and began scooping it back up with both hands. And there was something so quietly defeated about the set of his shoulders in that moment. Not rage, not frustration, just the patient acceptance of one more small thing going wrong, that Stella set down her parcel and crouched beside him before she had consciously decided to do so. He looked at her sideways. He had gray eyes, she saw now. Not cold gray, but the gray of sky before a storm that might bring good rain or might not. Uncertain whether gray. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and kept scooping. They collected the corn in silence. Joe came out with a new sack, grumbling cheerfully about the way sacks were made nowadays compared to the way they used to be made, which was a topic he could develop with considerable enthusiasm if left uninterrupted, and Calvin thanked him and stood and looked down at Stella, who was still on one knee gathering the last scattered kernels from between 2 boards. "Calvin Easton," he said, and offered his hand. She stood, brushing her palm against her skirt before taking it. "Stella Hale. I teach at the schoolhouse on the East Road." "I know," he said. And then, as though surprising himself, "I've seen you out on the steps at noon." She thought about that. 3 miles was too far to see from the Darby place, which meant he had been close enough to notice her on the steps at some point and had remembered it and had just told her that without meaning to. "You are welcome to attend services at First Baptist if you are inclined," she said, because it was the kind of practical social offering that people made in small towns when a newcomer had been keeping largely to himself, and because it seemed safer than acknowledging what he had just revealed. "Thank you," he said. He did not commit to anything. He picked up the new sack of corn, set it carefully in the wagon, and nodded at her with a formality that was not coldness but rather the careful movement of a man who has drawn a new boundary for himself and is not yet sure where to place it. She picked up her primer and went home. She thought about him quite a bit more after that. The summer that came to Harlan Creek in 1878 was a slow one. the kind that arrived without ceremony and settled in like a guest who intended to stay. The heat built early, and by June it was a presence you navigated around rather than through, and the whole town took on a slower rhythm: church on Sundays, the social at the Grange Hall on the second Saturday of every month, the weekly market on Fridays where the farmers brought their early vegetables, and the women brought preserves and pies, and the children ran between the wagons until someone's mother called them sharply to heel. Stella went to the Friday market every week. It was one of the ways she stayed connected to the families of her students, which was important when you were trying to understand what a child was living through at home, and why a particular boy had stopped turning in his work, or why a particular girl had started crying in arithmetic. Teaching, Stella had learned, was mostly the work of paying attention. She saw Calvin there on the second Friday in June. He was buying early tomatoes from the Weston farm stand, and he was talking to Pete Lord, who had apparently brought his wife and 3 children along, and one of the children, the youngest, a girl of about 2, had apparently decided that Calvin's boot was a suitable climbing post. Calvin looked down at the child attached to his ankle with an expression that moved through several things very quickly: surprise, something close to pain, and then a very deliberate settling into a careful kindness that cost him something. He reached down and gently detached the child and handed her back to Pete's wife, and then he turned away and looked at the sky for a moment with the quiet, determined blankness of a man who is waiting for himself to be all right again. Stella was on the other side of the market, and he did not see her watching, and she did not let on that she had. She was connecting things: a man who bought a new property in a strange town, a letter sent to a dead wife, a reaction to a small child that moved through pain before settling into kindness. She was forming a picture, and the picture was quiet and aching, and she did not rush it. She went on about her business, and bought her tomatoes from the Weston stand after Calvin had moved on, and chatted with Mrs. Weston about the summer squash, and went home and put up a small jar of tomato preserves and thought about grief, and how it hides in ordinary moments, in the weight of a child on your boot, in the smell of corn, in a letter you send to an address where no one will answer. The second Saturday in June brought the Grange Social, which was the most significant social event of the month for most of Harlan Creek's residents, and was attended even by people who claimed not to enjoy dancing or socializing, because the alternative was sitting at home alone, and most people discovered when pressed that they did not actually prefer that. Stella wore her blue cotton dress, the one with the small white buttons down the front, and she danced twice with James Alderman and once with old Pastor Wells, who danced with the focused determination of a man completing an obligatory task, and she ate a piece of Della Hopper's lemon cake, which was extraordinary, and she talked to the mothers of several of her students about the upcoming summer term. Calvin Easton came in about an hour after the social had started. He came in the way men come into rooms when they are not sure they should have come: carefully, taking stock, standing near the edge of things. He had washed and shaved and was wearing a clean white shirt, and he looked so substantially like a different person from the man who had been rebuilding a barn for 2 months that Stella took an extra second to be certain it was him. Then she saw the gray eyes and was certain. He spoke to Pete Lord. He spoke to Joe Hartwell. He accepted a cup of punch from someone's wife and held it the way you hold something when you are not going to drink it but need something to do with your hands. The fiddle started up a reel and people arranged themselves enthusiastically, and in the general reorganization of the room, Calvin ended up beside Stella near the punch table. "Good evening, Mr. Easton," she said. "Miss Hale." He glanced at the dancers. "Do you dance?" "I do," she said. "Do you?" "I used to," he said, and left it there, and they watched the reel together for a moment without speaking. "The barn looks good," she said. "I ride the South Road sometimes. You have made remarkable progress." He looked at her briefly. "You were paying attention." "I pay attention to most things," she said honestly. "It is a quality that some people find irritating." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the memory of where a smile might go. "I do not find it irritating," he said. "Good," she said. They stood there, not dancing, not particularly talking, and it was not uncomfortable. Stella had noticed over the years that the quality of a person's silence tells you a great deal about them, whether it is aggressive or defensive or comfortable or lost. Calvin Easton's silence was the last kind. Not hostile, not deliberate. Simply the silence of a man who was wandering in a room he used to know how to navigate and could not quite remember the layout of. She did not try to navigate it for him. She just stood beside him in it, and after a while he said, "Would you like some more punch?" And she said yes, and he got it. And when he handed it to her, their fingers touched briefly around the cup, and he did not flinch away from the contact, and neither did she. And that was something, she thought. That was something. He did not come back to the Grange the following Saturday, and she did not see him at the market that Friday either. And she had just begun to think that perhaps he had retreated back into his solitary reconstruction of the Darby place, and intended to stay there indefinitely, when she rounded the corner of the schoolhouse one Tuesday morning in early July and found him there. He was looking at the building with his hat in his hand, which she was beginning to understand was a gesture he made when he was uncertain about something. "Mr. Easton," she said. He turned. "Miss Hale." He glanced at the schoolhouse door. "I was wondering, that is, I wanted to ask." He paused, and the pause was long enough that she simply waded through it without filling it. "I read at about the level of a reasonable man," he said finally, "but my figures are not what they should be. My wife was always the one who," he stopped, tried again. "I am managing the accounts on the property, and I am struggling with some of the numbers. I wondered whether you offered any evening instruction for adults." She looked at him steadily. She did not react to the stumble over wife, did not acknowledge it, did not offer him the mercy of pretending she had not heard it. He did not need her to pretend. He needed someone to simply let the stumble be a stumble and move on. "I do not currently," she said, "but I am not opposed to it. Tuesday and Thursday evenings here at the schoolhouse after 6. Bring your ledger." He blinked as though he had expected more negotiation. "Just like that. Just like that," she said. "You are not the first adult in this town to need help with figures, Mr. Easton, and you will not be the last." He nodded and put his hat back on. "Thursday then," he said. "Thursday," she agreed, and watched him walk back toward his wagon and felt something warm and careful settling somewhere in her chest, which she examined honestly and then let sit without rushing it anywhere it was not ready to go. Thursday evening came with one of those tremendous golden Texas sunsets that look like someone has set the western sky on deliberate fire. And Calvin arrived at the schoolhouse at 10 minutes past 6 with a cloth-bound ledger, and an expression of such careful neutrality that it might have made another person think he did not care about being there. Stella had learned to read him a little better than that. She pushed two of the small desks together to make a working surface and lit the lamp and sat beside him rather than across from him, because the work required them to look at the same pages, and because there is something about the side-by-side arrangement that is less confrontational than face-to-face when you are doing something a person finds slightly humbling. The figures were not bad. He had a solid grasp of the basics. What he had trouble with was the forecasting, the planning ahead across seasons, the kind of calculation you needed to do when you were deciding how much seed to buy against how much yield you expected and what you needed to carry over. "Your wife handled this," she said, and it was not a question, and she said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything, because the only way to handle delicate things without breaking them was to be absolutely steady with them. He looked at the ledger. "She was very good with numbers," he said. "Better than I am, better than most people I have ever met." "What was her name?" Stella asked, and she asked it quietly, the way you ask about something precious, and she watched his hands tighten very slightly on the edge of the book. "Anna," he said. Then, with the carefulness of a man who has been deciding whether to say more for some time, "Anna Rose Easton. She grew up in a town called Kerrville. She taught herself accounting from books because her father owned a dry goods store and she wanted to understand the business." He paused. "She was 28 years old." Stella did not say she was sorry. She did not say she could not imagine. She did not say any of the things people say when they do not know what else to say. She said, "She sounds like a remarkable person," and left room for him to either agree or say nothing. And he said very quietly, "She was," and that was enough. That was right. They worked through the ledger for 2 hours. By the end of it, Calvin had grasped the seasonal forecasting well enough to apply it on his own, and Stella had written out a formula in her clearest hand and folded it inside the ledger cover. He stood to leave and hesitated at the door. "Miss Hale," he said, "I appreciate you not making it a larger thing than it is." She looked at him in the warm amber of the lamplight and understood exactly what he meant. He meant the ledger and Anna and all of it. He meant that she had not performed sympathy at him or made his loss into a story that was somehow about her feelings. He meant that she had let him be a man who was grieving without making his grief the entire substance of the room. "Come back Thursday after next," she said. "We will work through the harvest projections." He nodded, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it sometimes did, that almost smile. "Thursday after next," he said, and went out into the cooling July evening. And Stella sat for a moment in the empty schoolroom and let herself feel the very edge of something she was not going to name yet, not until it had the right size and shape for naming. The summer moved forward the way Texas summers do, with an indifference to the people enduring them that is almost admirable. The heat kept on. The cattle kept on. The town went about its business, and Calvin Easton went about his, and every 2 weeks on Thursday evenings, he came to the schoolhouse and they worked on his figures, and then gradually they stopped always working on figures and sometimes just talked. He told her in pieces over several evenings about the ranch he had come from, a property outside of Fredericksburg that he had worked with his father until his father died, and then worked alone until he had enough to sell it and start fresh somewhere that did not have Anna's handwriting on the walls of every room. He said that last part without embellishment or self-pity, as though it were simply a fact of geography. "You could not stay," she said. "I could not stay," he agreed. Everything looked like her, not literally, but the way a place looks when you have loved someone there, the dust and the light and the shape of the land, it all carries the person. He stopped. "I sound like someone trying to write a poem." "You sound like someone telling the truth," she said. He looked at her directly for a moment. Calvin did not look at people directly as a rule. He looked near them or past them or at the ground between you. When he looked at you directly, it meant something was happening in him that had bypassed the usual careful management. "You are very easy to tell the truth to," he said. "I am not sure how you manage that." "I do not judge the truth when I hear it," she said. "People can tell when you are not going to judge them. They stop rehearsing." "Is that what I have been doing, stopping rehearsing?" "A little," she said. "Yes." He looked out the window, where the August evening was going dark over the live oaks. "My wife used to say I was the most difficult man in the world to have a conversation with," he said, and there was the faintest hint of something warm in it now, in the way he could reference Anna, still tender, still careful, but no longer as though the name itself were a wound being reopened, more like a scar that had learned to sit quietly. "How long were you married?" Stella asked. 4 years, he said. We were expecting a child when the sickness came fast. Fever, both of them." He was quiet for a moment. "September of last year, both of them." Stella understood the letter now, the one returned to sender. He had lost a wife and an unborn child in the same terrible September, and he had come west and bought land and put every single ounce of himself into rebuilding something with his hands, because otherwise there was nothing to do with all of it. She did not cry. She did not reach for him. She sat still and quiet beside him and let the weight of it be in the room without trying to remove it, because you cannot remove grief like that, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not sat with it long enough to know. After a time he said, "I have not told anyone here that. Not that part." "I am glad you told me," she said simply. He nodded slowly. "So am I," he said. And then, with the almost smile that was becoming a little more frequent now, a little easier, "Your figures lesson has gone significantly off topic." "I have always believed in flexible curriculum," she said, and he laughed, actually laughed, a short surprised sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, and they both looked at each other for a moment as though the laugh were a small animal that had appeared unexpectedly in the room and they were deciding whether it was safe to approach. Something shifted, quietly and irrevocably in that moment. Nothing dramatic, no declaration. Just the simple recognition, mutual and unspoken, that something had changed, that the room between them was different than it had been, and neither of them was unhappy about it. Stella walked home that evening under a sky full of August stars, and felt the thing she had been not naming quietly find its shape and its name. And she sat with it in the kitchen for a while over a cup of coffee and was honest with herself about it, the way she was always honest about most things, and concluded that she was falling in love with a man who was still, in some important ways, finding his way back to the living, and that this required more patience than she had ever applied to anything. And that she had the patience. She was 26 years old. She had seen what careless love looked like. Thomas Whitfield in Abilene had been careless with her, and she had survived it, and what she had learned was that careful love was worth waiting for. That a love between two people who had each learned something about loss was a different thing entirely from the bright, ignorant kind, not better or worse, but layered, built on a foundation that had already been tested. She did not rush Calvin Easton. She did not let on the full size of what she was feeling. She simply continued to be exactly what she had been from the beginning, steady, clear, present, and entirely without the particular cruelty of pretending not to notice his grief while also pretending it was fine. The harvest came early in September, and Calvin's fields came in better than he had projected, which he told her on the first Thursday of the month with something that was undeniably satisfaction. The barn was fully repaired. He had bought 3 more horses and was planning to add a small herd of longhorns in the spring. The Darby place was beginning to look like something that belonged to someone, not like something abandoned at the edge of the world. "You have done a great deal of work in a very short time," she told him. "Work is useful," he said, and she heard the double meaning in it without commenting on it. They were sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse because the evening was cool enough to be pleasant, and the inside of the building had been hot all day from the children's bodies and the September sun, and the stars were appearing one at a time over the roof of the livery stable across the road. "Miss Hale," he said, after a comfortable silence. "Stella." She looked at him. He had not used her first name before. He was looking at the stars with his hat balanced on one knee. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask that you are fully free to say no, and it will not change anything. I will still come on Thursday evenings if you will still have me." "Ask," she said. "Would you be willing to come out to the property on Sunday? I have been building something, and I would like—" He stopped. "I would like to show you." She considered him in the warm dark, this man who had ridden into town carrying a grief nobody else had bothered to look at, who had rebuilt a barn and planted fields and taught himself to laugh again at a figure lesson that had long since stopped being about figures. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He let out a breath that was quiet but definitely there. "Sunday then," he said. "About mid-morning." "About mid-morning," she agreed. He stood, put his hat on, nodded at her with that formal nod she had come to understand as his version of an embrace, and walked to his horse. She watched him ride south down the road and stayed on the steps a moment longer, looking at the emerging stars, and allowed herself to feel the full warmth of the anticipation, which was quite a lot. Sunday came with a genuinely beautiful morning, the kind that September occasionally delivers in Texas, as though in apology for the summer it has just finished inflicting. Cool and clear, with a sky of that deep, unblemished blue that seems to go all the way to the moon. Stella rode out on her horse, a steady bay mare named Clara, along the south road past the live oaks and turned down the lane toward the Darby property. The difference from what it had looked like in the spring was striking enough that she pulled Clara to a stop for a moment at the edge of it. The barn was sound and painted. The fences were good. The east field, harvested now, had that particular tidiness of well-tended land, the rows visible even in their empty state. There were flower boxes on the porch of the house. That last detail surprised her enough that she looked twice, because it was the kind of detail that speaks very specifically to where a person's mind has been going. Calvin was standing beside the fence near the barn, and he raised a hand when he saw her. She rode over and dismounted, and he took Clara's reins without being asked, and tied her to the post with the easy automatic competence of someone who has been around horses all his life. "The place looks wonderful," she said, and she meant every word of it. "Come and see what I wanted to show you," he said. He led her around to the far side of the property, beyond the house, to where a small wooden structure had been built in the shelter of two large pecans. It was a gazebo, she realized, or the beginnings of an open-sided structure with a roof and a simple railing, with a wooden bench inside it, and beside the bench a small table, and on the table a jar of wildflowers. She stopped and looked at it. "I built it over the summer," he said, standing a few feet behind her. "I needed something to do in the evenings after the main work was done. Something that was not something that was forward-looking, I suppose." A pause. "I built it thinking about someone." Stella turned around. He was standing in the morning light with his hat in his hand, and the look on his face was not the careful, neutral look he had worn for most of the months she had known him. It was open. It was, for the first time, completely open, all of it visible, the loss and the healing and the tentative extraordinary hope, laid out with a courage she recognized as enormous. "Calvin," she said. "I know I am not an easy man," he said. "I know I know grief does not simply depart. I know that. But I also know that for the past several months you have been the best part of most weeks, and I have been trying to be careful about that because I did not want to confuse gratitude with something else, and I no longer believe it is confusion." He looked down at his hat briefly and then back at her. "I would very much like to court you, Stella Hale, if you are amenable to it, properly and openly and with full intention." The morning light fell through the pecan leaves onto the gazebo and onto the small jar of wildflowers, and onto the face of a man who had survived something enormous and chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to put himself here, in front of her, with his hat in his hand and his heart in his eyes. "I am very amenable to it," she said. The smile that crossed his face then was not the half-smile, not the almost smile, but a real one, wide and sudden and a little helpless, the way a smile looks when it has been contained a long time. It transformed him. She saw in it the man he had been before September, the man who had laughed easily and loved openly, and she saw also the man he had become, and she thought both versions deserved everything she had. He took 2 steps toward her and offered his hand, not in the formal handshaking way but palm up, an offering, and she put her hand in it, and they stood for a moment in the pecan shade, while the morning moved around them with its own sweet indifference. "Come and sit," he said, and they went into the gazebo and sat on the bench together, and Clara shifted peacefully near the fence post, and somewhere in the oaks a mockingbird started up, and they talked for a long time about everything and nothing, the way people do when they have found the person they want to talk to most, and are just beginning to understand the full extent of what that means. The courtship of Stella Hale and Calvin Easton was the kind that the women of Harlan Creek discussed with a mixture of admiration and gentle frustration, because it was conducted with such patience and deliberateness that it almost seemed to be happening in slow motion. Though the people involved were clearly not slow about their feelings, they were simply careful. He brought her flowers from the gazebo garden he had planted. He walked her home from the Grange social in October, and from the harvest supper in November. He sat with her in church with his hat in his hands, and listened to Pastor Wells with the focused attention of a man who had had some dealings with God that needed working through. He came to the schoolhouse on Thursday evenings, and they no longer pretended it was about figures, though sometimes she did help him with the ledger because she genuinely enjoyed it. Della Hopper told Stella, over the back fence in October, that she thought Calvin Easton was the most serious man she had ever watched court a woman. "He is serious," Stella agreed. "Is that what you want?" Della asked with the frank curiosity of a woman who has always preferred directness. "I want him," Stella said simply, and Della laughed, a big warm laugh that she sent up into the October afternoon with considerable energy. In November, on an evening when the first cold of the season had come down from the north and made the schoolhouse walls creak, Calvin arrived on Thursday evening with something different in his manner, not nervous exactly, but concentrated, as though he had made a decision and was carrying it carefully. He sat down at the pushed-together desks and looked at her. "I have been thinking," he said. She said. "About the fact that I am 32 years old and I have rebuilt a property and put in a winter crop, and I have been thinking about the future in a way I could not think about it a year ago." He folded his hands on the desk. "I have also been thinking about you in a way I have been trying to be careful about, and I believe I am finished being careful." She folded her hands as well, matching his posture slightly, and waited. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want you to know that I asked you that way forward simply because I think you are a woman who deserves to be asked simply and not talked around. I want to marry you. I want to build something with you. I know that I carry things, and I know that you have seen those things, and I know that you have never once," his voice steadied. "You have never once made it worse. You have only ever made it better. That is a rare quality in a person, and I know my own luck when I am standing in front of it." Stella looked at this man. This good, careful, broken and rebuilding man, with his gray eyes and his hat on the desk beside him and his hands folded and his whole honest heart in the room with her. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment, as though he were waiting for the word to resolve itself into its full meaning. Then his hands unfolded and he reached across the small distance of the desk and took both of her hands in his. "Yes," she said again, softer. His thumbs moved over the backs of her hands just slightly, just gently, and she felt the warmth of that simple contact move all the way through her. "I do not have a ring yet," he said. "You do not need a ring yet," she said. "I will get one. I know you will." He stood and came around the desks, and she stood too, and he put both his hands on her face very gently, looking at her with that open expression she had seen in the morning light at the gazebo, and that still had the power to move her completely. And he kissed her softly and carefully, the way he did most things, with full attention and no rushing. And she kissed him back and put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palms, steady and present and here. The November wind found the schoolhouse and pressed at the walls, and the lamp burned steadily between them, and Stella Hale, who had spent 3 years in a small Texas town being very clear-eyed about people and very patient about the right kind of love, allowed herself to feel the full weight of having found it. They were married in December, just before Christmas, at First Baptist Church in Harlan Creek, with Pastor Wells officiating in the deliberate manner of a man who has always treated marriage as the serious business it is. The church was full, because Harlan Creek was the kind of town that filled a church when there was something worth celebrating, and a school teacher who had been considered perhaps too self-sufficient for her own good, and a solitary rancher who had ridden in from grief and stayed for love was, by any reasonable measure, something worth celebrating. Della Hopper sat in the second pew and cried in the generous, uncomplicated way she did everything. Pete Lord and his wife sat near the back with their 3 children, the youngest of whom had apparently forgotten her previous attachment to Calvin's boot in favor of a fascination with the ribbons on her own collar. Joe Hartwell wore his good jacket. The students from the schoolhouse had made a paper banner that read "Congratulations, Miss Hale," which was now technically incorrect, but which Stella had insisted be displayed anyway. Calvin stood at the front of the church and watched Stella come down the aisle in a cream-colored dress she had made herself over several late-night sessions, with her chestnut hair pinned up and a few small winter wildflowers from the garden beside the gazebo tucked into it. And the expression on his face was the kind that made Della Hopper cry harder and made Joe Hartwell clear his throat with unexpected feeling. They said their vows in the plain, clear language of the 1878 Book of Common Prayer, which did not embellish because it did not need to. And when Calvin said "I will" in his even, careful voice, it carried the full understanding of a man who had already learned what it meant to lose and who was saying yes with his eyes fully open to everything that could come, the good and the terrible alike, and choosing it all. When he kissed her at the altar, there was a sound from the congregation that was not quite a cheer, and not quite a sigh, but the particular warm exhalation of a room full of people collectively witnessing something right. They had a wedding supper at the Grange Hall with Della Hopper's lemon cake and dancing, and Calvin danced with Stella for 3 dances in a row, which was noted and approved by everyone in the room, and she danced against his shoulder and felt his hand warm and sure at her back, and thought that some things, the good things, are worth every month of patience. Life at the Darby property, which people were beginning to call the Easton place now, as towns gradually rename things to match their current realities, settled into a rhythm that surprised Stella with how naturally she fell into it. She continued teaching at the schoolhouse, because teaching was not something she had been doing until something better came along. It was something she was and intended to go on being, and Calvin supported this with the uncomplicated respect of a man who understood that a person's work is part of who they are. She planted more in the flower boxes on the porch. She got the kitchen properly organized to her satisfaction, which took about 3 weeks and a frank conversation with a kitchen that had been arranged by a man who found cooking a purely functional activity. She learned the property in all its seasons, the way the light hit the gazebo in the mornings, and the way the pecan grove smelled in November, and which fence post the mockingbird preferred in spring. Calvin moved through the first months of their marriage with a gentleness that she had expected, and a warmth that she was learning to expect, and also with an occasional darkness that came, as she had always known it would, because grief is not a thing that marriage dissolves. It is a thing you carry with you into your next life and learn, slowly, to carry differently. She saw it sometimes in the evenings, when he had been alone all day on the property and had worked too hard and had too much quiet in which to think. She saw it in December on the day that would have been Anna's birthday, when he came in from the field and sat at the kitchen table and was silent for a long time. She sat with him. She made coffee. She did not ask what he was thinking because she knew what he was thinking, and she did not pretend not to know, and she did not perform understanding at him. She simply stayed. After a while he said, "Thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For not needing me to explain," he said. She put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that until the darkness outside pressed fully in and she got up and lit the lamp. There was a Sunday in February when they rode out together, she on Clara, he on his big gray, Sergeant, to the northern edge of the property where Calvin was planning to extend the fence line for the new cattle. The day was cold and bright, and the Texas plains stretched out around them with that enormous indifference that the land has out here, the kind that makes human lives seem very small and very bright against it. He pulled Sergeant to a stop and looked out over the land, and she stopped beside him. She would have loved this, he said quietly, and she did not have to ask who. She always wanted to be somewhere with this much sky. Stella looked at the sky, which was enormous and blue and completely indifferent to everyone under it. Then she would have liked it here, she said. He looked at her, and there was gratitude in his face that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with the relief of being allowed to love 2 things, a grief and a hope, without apology. She would have liked you, he said. She would have liked you a great deal. Stella considered that for a moment, feeling the real weight of it, not the awkwardness of a compliment from a husband about a first wife, but the genuine gift it was, the particular generosity of a man who was telling her something true about both the woman he had lost and the woman he had found. "That means a great deal to me," she said honestly. He reached across from Sergeant and touched her face briefly, and she leaned into it for a moment, And then the horses shifted, and the cold wind came over the plain, and they turned back toward the property with the blue sky overhead and the work of the afternoon waiting. In the spring of 1879, Stella learned she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for a day before she told Calvin, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she wanted to sit with it herself first, to take its full measure. She was 27 years old. She had wanted children in the way she had wanted most good things, patiently, without demanding that they arrive on any particular schedule. She told him on a Thursday evening, which was their evening by long habit, sitting in the gazebo in the first warm April air. She told him plainly, the way she told everything, here is a fact, here is what it means, here is what comes next. He was absolutely still for a moment. Then he turned toward her on the bench and took both her hands in both of his and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before and could not entirely read, because it was several things at once, wonder and fear, and a love so large it had pushed every other thing temporarily aside, and underneath all of it, very quiet, the ghost of a sorrow she would not make him explain. "Stella," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said gently. He put his forehead against her hands, which he was still holding. She felt his breath against her fingers, even and deliberate, the way he breathed when he was managing something enormous. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Yes," he said without lifting his head. "Then are you?" "A little," she said, "but mostly I am glad." He lifted his head. His eyes were bright, and she thought he was very close to crying, though she did not name it, and he would probably not have named it either, being the kind of man he was. He pulled her in and held her carefully, and she put her arms around him and rested her cheek against his shoulder. "We will be all right," she said. He held her tighter briefly, then settled. "Yes," he said. "We will." Summer came. The cattle Calvin had added in the spring were doing well. Pete Lourd's older brother had come from Easton looking for work, and Calvin had hired him, and the property was beginning to feel like an operation, like something with momentum and purpose. The townspeople of Harlan Creek had fully incorporated Calvin Easton into the fabric of the place now. He was no longer the solitary stranger from east of the Colorado, but the Easton rancher, Stella's husband, a man who helped neighbors with fence repair and attended church every Sunday, and had been known, on more than one occasion, to stop on the road and lift a stranger's wagon wheel out of a rut with nothing asked in return. Stella taught through the summer session and into the fall with the pragmatic determination of a woman who intended to manage her own body on her own terms for as long as was reasonable, which her students found entirely unsurprising, because their teacher had always been the kind of person who did exactly what she intended. In October, when the air had cooled and the pecans were coming down, and the longhorns were fat on the autumn grass, Calvin finished a project he had been working on for several months. He took Stella by the hand one Sunday morning and led her through the house to the back room, the one that had been used for storage, which had been cleared and cleaned and freshly whitewashed and furnished with a small wooden bed he had built himself, its headboard carved with a running horse and a field of small stars. Stella stood in the doorway and looked at it. "I thought," he said behind her, "the stars were right, because you have always looked at the stars in a particular way, like you are glad they are there." She turned and put both hands on his face, the way he had held hers at the altar, and kissed him thoroughly, and he laughed against her mouth and then kissed her back with equal thoroughness. "It is perfect," she said. "The horse was easier than the stars," he said. "You carved every single one of them." 47, he said. "I counted." She kissed him again for the stars. On the 23rd of November, 1879, in the bedroom of the Easton place on the South Road outside Harlan Creek, Texas, with Della Hopper in attendance acting as midwife, which was one of her several practical competencies, Stella delivered a boy. He came into the world at about 3 in the morning with the kind of furious announcement that suggested he intended to be taken seriously, and was placed into his father's hands while Stella, exhausted and perfectly content, watched Calvin hold his son for the first time. Calvin stood completely still for a long moment, looking at the small, fierce person in his arms, and the expressions moving through his face were too complicated to catalog. They had history in them, deep and old, and they had newness in them too, the stunning particular newness of a person who has believed himself done with certain kinds of happiness and found himself utterly wrong. "Hello," he said quietly to the baby in his even careful voice, and the baby, as though understanding perfectly that this was a significant moment requiring at least some respect, paused in its crying. Stella laughed, soft with tiredness. Calvin looked at her over their son's head. His eyes were bright, unmistakable. He was not managing anything this time. He was simply present in it, fully and without reserve. "Stella," he said. "I know," she said. They named him Thomas James Easton Thomas for no one in particular. James because Calvin's father had been James, and it seemed right to bring him forward into this new thing. The James Easton of the former generation had been a hard-working, quiet man who had raised a son who was hard-working and quiet, and Stella thought the name suited the child, who arrived apparently prepared to be heard, but quickly developed a contemplative streak in his first weeks that was recognizably inherited. Tom, which he became almost immediately, despite the formal intentions of his parents, had dark hair like his father and brown eyes that might have come from either side, and a serious expression that appeared at about 3 weeks old and never quite went away. He was not a difficult baby, though he was a determined one. He seemed to feel strongly that the world owed him an explanation. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was one of the warmer ones, which was a relief to everyone in Harlan Creek who had been watching the weather with the particular anxiety of people who have just added new cattle to a herd. The Easton Longhorns came through well. The spring planting was early and good. Stella returned to the schoolhouse in January, which caused a small social stir among the women who felt she ought to have stayed home longer, and which Stella handled with the same steady equanimity with which she handled most things, by acknowledging their opinions fully and doing as she intended. Della Hopper, who was approximately the social authority of record in Harlan Creek on all matters, told anyone who brought it up that Stella Hale Easton had been perfectly clear about what kind of woman she was from the beginning, and anyone who was surprised now had not been paying attention, and that the schoolchildren of this town were lucky to have her, and so was Calvin Easton, and everyone should mind their own business and have some cake. This largely settled the matter. The school grew that year. 3 new families had come to the area in the preceding 12 months, the Delacroix family from Louisiana, the Reeds from Missouri, and the Vasquez family from South Texas, whose children came speaking primarily Spanish, and who the older students initially regarded with the territorial wariness of children who have not been taught better, which gave Stella the opportunity for several important conversations about the nature of fairness. She was good at those conversations. She had always believed that children could understand justice when it was explained to them plainly and without condescension, and she had accumulated considerable evidence in support of this belief. By spring, her students were playing together in the schoolyard without distinction that she could see, and the Vasquez children were reading well in English, and one of them, a boy named Miguel who was 9 and extraordinarily sharp, had taught half the class to count to 20 in Spanish, which Stella had encouraged warmly and which had caused exactly one parental complaint, which she had addressed by explaining her reasoning calmly and completely until the complaining parent ran out of objections. Calvin had watched her handle that one from across the kitchen table where she had been rehearsing her argument on him, and had said with quiet admiration, "I have never seen anyone construct a case the way you do." "I was on the debate team in Abilene," she said. "Was there a debate team in Abilene?" "There was after I suggested it," she said, and he had smiled his full real smile, the one that still occasionally ambushed her with its warmth. Tom sat up by himself in March, which was apparently early and which he accomplished with the same concentrated determination that characterized all his efforts. Calvin sat on the kitchen floor and watched his son achieve verticality for the first time with an expression so clear and open and happy that Stella, coming in from outside with an armful of linens, stopped in the doorway and just looked at him for a moment, quietly grateful for the uncomplicated joy of the scene. He caught her looking and reached out a hand without getting up, and she came and took it and sat on the floor beside him, and Tom regarded them both from his achieved vertical position with the serious satisfaction of someone who has made a point. "He is going to be absolutely sure of himself," Calvin said. "Look where he learned it," Stella said. "I am not sure of myself." "You are the most quietly certain person I have ever met," she said. "You simply do not make noise about it." He considered this. "Is that a compliment?" "It is a fact," she said. "Most facts about you are compliments." He looked at her sideways warmly. "You are going to make me vain." "I don't believe that is possible," she said. Tom, apparently feeling he had been ignored for too long, reached out and grabbed his father's finger with both hands and inserted himself back into the center of the proceedings, where he clearly felt he belonged. The summer of 1880 was hotter than the last, which was saying something, and it brought a dry stretch in July that made the ranchers nervous and the farmers outright worried. The creek ran low. Several of the smaller farms to the north of Harlan Creek had trouble with their wells. Calvin drove water out to the Vasquez property twice in July when their well dropped to nothing, loading barrels in the wagon and making the trip himself without fanfare, which Stella learned about from Miguel's mother at the Friday market and not from her husband. "You did not tell me about the water," she said that evening. "It needed doing," he said, as though this were the complete explanation, and she supposed it was. She put her hand on his face the same way she always did when she was feeling something she wanted him to know, and he leaned into it the way he always did now, without hesitation, without the careful uncertainty of the early days. "You are a good man, Calvin Easton," she said. "I am trying to be," he said. "You are not trying, you simply are." He turned his face into her palm for a moment. "You see me better than I see myself," he said. "I see you clearly," she said. "There is a difference." He took her hand from his face and held it. "There is a difference," he agreed. The Grange social in August brought news that the railroad was definitively coming, not just as a rumor, but as a real thing with surveys done and dates discussed. Harlan Creek would be on the line, which meant the town was going to change, going to grow, and the ranchers who had been selling their cattle through the long drives were going to have a new option, which was either very good news or the end of something, depending on who you asked. Calvin sat with Pete Lord and the Delacroix man and two other ranchers around one of the back tables at the Grange, talking about what the railroad meant for the spring drive, and Stella sat nearby with Della and Mrs. Vasquez and several of the other women and listened to both conversations simultaneously, which was a skill she had developed years ago and found consistently useful. Later, walking home under a sky made enormous by the summer dark, with Calvin's hand warm around hers, she said, "What do you think about the railroad?" "I think it changes the geometry of things," he said, which was the way he talked about matters of large consequence in practical terms that had philosophy underneath them. "Good change or bad change? Both," he said. "The way most change is," he glanced at her. "What do you think?" "I think it means more people coming," she said, "which means more children in the school, which means I need to talk to the town council about adding a second teacher." "Of course that is what you think," he said, warm and amused. "What else would I think?" she said, and he laughed, and she leaned into his shoulder for a moment as they walked, and the night was warm around them and the future was there ahead, open and unknown and entirely unfrightening. In the fall of 1880, Della Hopper's husband Edward had a stroke that left him bedridden, and the town rallied around them in the practical way that towns do when one of their own is in need. Stella organized a meal rotation that she coordinated with the kind of brisk competence that made people do what she needed without feeling organized. Calvin handled the Hopper fence repair and the wood supply through the winter, quietly and without being asked. Della sat with Stella one October afternoon on the porch of the Easton house, watching Tom toddle in determined circles around the yard while Calvin talked across the fence with Pete Lord, and Della said, "You know, when he first rode into town, I thought, here is a man who has shut himself down." "He had," Stella said, "and you just walked right up beside him and waited." "I did not rush anything," Stella said. "Most women would have," Della said. "Most people would have. It is terribly uncomfortable to watch someone carry something heavy and not try to take it from them." Stella watched Calvin across the yard, laughing at something Pete had said, his hat pushed back on his head, his whole posture easy in the autumn light. "You cannot take it from them," she said. "You can only be present while they figure out a new way to carry it." Della was quiet for a moment. "That is a very wise thing," she said. "I learned it from watching it work," Stella said. Edward Hopper recovered better than expected, to everyone's relief and the particular relief of Della, who loved her husband with a blunt, unsentimental ferocity that was entirely characteristic of her. By winter he was up and moving, though more slowly than before, and the town exhaled collectively. Christmas of 1880 was celebrated at the Easton place, which had become, without anyone quite deciding it formally, the place where things happened. Stella cooked, which she was good at, and Calvin built a fire large enough to heat the whole ground floor, and Tom ate an entire piece of pie with the focused dedication of someone discovering something important, and Della and Edward sat in the good chairs by the fire, and Pete Lord brought his family, and Joe Hartwell came with his widowed sister from Abilene, and the Vasquez family brought tamales, which were received with considerable enthusiasm, and the house was loud with company and firelight. Calvin sat beside Stella on the settee in the late evening when most of the guests had gone, with Tom asleep in his arms and the fire burning down to embers, and Stella leaned against his shoulder and felt the house settle around them. "This is what I wanted," he said quietly, looking at the room. "When I drove into this town, not specifically this, but something like this, something that had warmth in it again." She put her hand on his arm. "Did you think you would find it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I hoped," he said. "I was not sure hope was enough, but it was, apparently." "It was," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, warm and sure. Tom slept on, oblivious and complete. January of 1881 brought a cold snap that kept most of the town indoors and Calvin largely in the barn, which he did not complain about but which Stella addressed by making a thermos of strong coffee each morning and walking it out to him, a ritual that became established so quickly it seemed to have always existed. He was always surprised by it, every morning. As though he expected to turn around and find the barn empty, the cold unchanged, and she was quietly determined that he would never find the barn empty. They talked about expansion in February, whether to put in a second field, whether the cattle herd was at the right size or should grow, whether the Delacroix property to the east might come available, and what they would do if it did. They sat at the kitchen table with his ledger and her papers and Tom between them on the bench, nominally eating breakfast but primarily redistributing it across the tabletop, and they talked about the future with the ease of two people who have decided it belongs to them. In the spring of 1881, Stella learned she was expecting again. She told Calvin in the gazebo as she had told him the first time because the gazebo was their place, had been their place since the morning he had brought her there with his hat in his hand and a jar of wildflowers on the table. He took her hands in his and said nothing for a moment and then said very simply, "Good." She laughed. "Just good." "I mean it to be more than that," he said. "I just good is what I have. It is a very full good." "That is enough," she said. "Is it enough?" He asked, with a sincerity that was entirely without irony. She looked at him in the spring morning, this man she had watched come back from the edge of the world, this man who had rebuilt everything including himself, who carried his grief now the way a man carries a scar, not hidden, not displayed, just lived with part of the whole. "Calvin," she said, "everything you give is enough. Everything you are is enough. I want you to believe that." He looked at her steadily, those gray eyes with all their complicated weather. "I am trying," he said. "I know," she said. "I can see you trying. That is also enough." He pulled her into him gently and she went, and they sat in the gazebo in the April light, with the birds making their spring announcements in the pecans, and the new cattle moving in the far field, and the house behind them with Tom's small voice saying something to someone only he could see. The second child was born in October of 1881, on a cool night with a half moon, and was a girl. Stella looked at her daughter for the first time with a feeling so specific and so large it did not have a name that she knew of. Calvin held her and was again entirely still in the way that meant something had gotten past all his careful management to the very center of him. They named her Anna. Stella had thought about this for months before proposing it, turning it over carefully, making sure she understood her own reasons. She proposed it one evening in August, sitting on the porch, and she watched Calvin's face very carefully. He was quiet for a long time. "You are certain," he said finally. "It is a beautiful name," she said, "and she was a remarkable person who you loved. That does not become less true because you also love me. A child with that name would carry something good." He reached out and took her hand without speaking and held it for a while and then said, "Anna," as though testing how it sat in the air between them. "Anna," she agreed. He pressed her hand. "Yes," he said. "Yes." Anna Rose Easton, named for a woman who had taught herself accounting from books and had wanted a place with enough sky, arrived in October and was immediately the most scrutinized person in Harlan Creek, because a rancher naming his new daughter after his first wife, while his second wife proposed it, was a story that Della Hopper called the most unexpectedly moving thing she had heard in 20 years. Tom, at nearly 2, regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of someone who has been the primary authority in a household and is reconsidering the political landscape. He arrived at acceptance within about 4 days, and by a week was bringing her things: a spoon, a bit of corn husk, a wooden horse from his box of toys, with a generosity that made both his parents blink. "He is going to be kind," Stella told Calvin. "He learned it from watching you," Calvin said. "He learned it from watching both of us," she said, and meant it entirely. Harlan Creek in the early 1880s was changing. The way the whole West was changing, the railroad having arrived in 1881, and with it a new frequency of strangers and a new pace of commerce and a new complicated relationship with the things that were being left behind. The cattle drives that had defined the decade before were becoming something else. The open range was being broken into smaller pieces by fences and land claims and the steady insistence of settlement. Men who had once ridden the Kishom Trail with the freedom of something not yet named were finding themselves in a world that had acquired corners. Calvin felt this change and spoke of it without sentimentality, but with honest acknowledgement. He had come here at the beginning of a transition, had built something just as the shape of what you could build was shifting, and he navigated it with the same practical care he navigated everything. The Easton Ranch had cattle, 2 good fields, 3 hired hands now, and a reputation for fair dealing that made it one of the more stable operations in the county. Calvin traded with the Vasquez family, whose son Miguel had grown into a capable young man who helped his father with the horses and who could still do sums faster than anyone else Stella had taught, which she considered one of her proudest professional accomplishments. She was still teaching. The second teacher she had campaigned the town council for was hired in 1882, a young woman from San Antonio named Clara Mendes. Not the horse, Stella always clarified, who was 23 and energetic and quickly became someone Stella was deeply glad to have in the school. They divided the students by age, and the school became twice as effective, which pleased Stella enormously. There was an evening in the spring of 1882 when Stella came in from the schoolhouse to find Calvin at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of him, and the particular stillness about him that she had learned to read over 4 years of marriage. Not the open grief, not the managed weight of the early days, but something older and quieter that came now less frequently and stayed a shorter time. She made coffee. She sat beside him, not across from him. After a while he said, "It is the 1st of April." She counted back. April 1st. She did not say anything. She waited. We met in April, he said. 3 years ago, 4. I have been trying to work out the right number and I believe it is 4. 4 years this month, she said. He was quiet. Then I spent a fair amount of last April unable to imagine standing where I am now. Which is where, she said. He looked at the kitchen, the table, her. Here, he said simply. She took his hand. He looked at it, their 2 hands on the table. I want to tell you something, he said. Then tell me, she said. I used to think, he paused, finding the words with the care he gave everything. I used to think that surviving something terrible meant you had used up your share of the good, that there was a balance somewhere that had been settled in your favor by grief and you had no right to ask for more. He looked at her. I was wrong. Yes, she said. I am very glad I was wrong. So am I, she said. He brought her hand up and pressed it to his mouth. Not a formal kiss, just a warm presence of lips against the back of her hand. And she felt it the way she felt everything he gave her, fully, completely, without the guarding that had characterized her loves before this one. In the summer of 1882, Tom, now 2.5 and in full command of language if not always volume, developed an attachment to the barn cat, a gray animal of uncertain age and emphatic personality that the hired hands called Gray, and that Tom called By, because he could not quite make the whole word yet, and which name stuck so firmly that even Calvin began to use it. Tom and By conducted their relationship with a mutual gravity that was remarkable in a toddler and a cat respectively, and the sight of Tom walking solemnly across the yard with By pacing beside him was something that became one of the images Stella kept in the very safest part of her memory, the kind you take out later in life when you need to remind yourself what the good days looked like. Anna was walking by fall, which was also early, and appeared to have inherited her mother's direct gaze and her father's quiet determination in equal measure, which was simultaneously wonderful and slightly daunting. She communicated preferences with a precision that transcended her limited vocabulary. She did not point vaguely. She pointed at exactly what she wanted and waited to be understood. She is going to be formidable, Calvin said, watching his daughter indicate without ambiguity that she wished to be set down immediately and allowed to investigate the porch steps under her own authority. She already is, Stella said. She gets it from you. She gets it from both of us, Stella said, and accepted Anna back from him when his daughter, having investigated the steps to her satisfaction, apparently concluded that her current elevation required a parent after all, and reached up with both arms in the manner of someone who has decided to accept assistance without indicating it was needed. The years built on each other the way good years do, each one adding something to the structure rather than merely repeating it. Calvin added a second barn in 1883. Stella helped negotiate a school budget increase from the town council in 1883 as well, which required several meetings and a written proposal of such comprehensive detail that the council members found themselves unable to identify a reasonable objection, which had been the point. Tom started at the schoolhouse in the fall of 1884, which was the strangest experience Stella had ever had as a teacher, watching her own child sit in the desk nearest the window and apply his serious attention to his primer with the focused intensity she knew from watching his father at the kitchen table. She was careful not to show favoritism. She was, if anything, slightly harder on Tom than on the other students, because she was aware of the temptation to be easy on him and chose the opposite course. Tom, who had his father's self-possession, accepted this with equanimity and continued to do excellent work largely, she suspected, on principle. Anna would follow in 2 years. Stella was already slightly dreading and largely looking forward to it. There was a September evening in 1884 when Stella and Calvin sat together in the gazebo after the children were in bed, in the grown version of the ritual that had started years before, when he had brought her here with wildflowers on the table. The flower garden around the gazebo was mature now, A real garden, 4 years of her planting and his occasional late evening maintenance, and the September air carried the smell of it on the cool that came after dark. "Do you remember the first time we sat here?" she asked. "You said yes to me," he said. "You were very nervous," she said. "I was not nervous. I was determined. Those are different things." "You were both," she said, and he allowed this with a small, dignified inclination of his head. The stars were coming out, the early ones, the ones that arrive while there is still color in the west and seem to be testing the darkness to see if it is ready. 47 stars carved in the headboard of a child's bed, the real ones uncountable. "Stella," he said. "Yes. Are you happy?" She turned and looked at him in the growing dark. He asked her this sometimes, not from insecurity but from the specific quality of a man who had learned not to take good things for granted, who knew that happiness was a living thing that needed to be checked on. "I am very happy," she said. "Are you?" He was quiet for a moment in the way she no longer worried about, the way she understood now as simply his manner of being honest rather than convenient. Then he said, "I am happier than I believed I was allowed to be, and I am grateful for it every day." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the September evening with the garden around them and the children in the house and the cattle in the field and the stars coming out one at a time overhead. She had walked into a general store one April morning 4 years ago and seen a man standing still in a town that did not stand still, with a shaking paper in his hand and a grief in his eyes that nobody had stopped to see. She had seen it. She had sat beside it in a dusty store aisle and helped pick up scattered corn and had never once, not for a single moment, made it worse. And what had grown from that, from the simple act of seeing and not looking away, was this: a man's laughter on a Friday morning, a child's footsteps on a wooden floor, a garden in September, a life built up carefully from the good material that remains after the worst things have happened and been survived. She turned her face up toward his and he bent to meet her, and the kiss they shared was unhurried and warm, and entirely the kiss of two people who have nowhere to be except exactly here, and the garden breathed around them, and the stars completed themselves overhead, and Harlan Creek, Texas, went on in its practical, uncelebrated way about the business of being a town where some things happen that deserve to be remembered. The October after that September evening brought a harvest so good that Calvin stood at the edge of the east field on the last day of it and looked at what 4 years of work had made, and Stella stood beside him and watched him look, and saw on his face the full, unguarded satisfaction of a man who has built something real and knows it. He put his arm around her shoulders. "I want to add the north field next year," he said. "Then we will add the north field," she said. Tom appeared from somewhere behind them, with hay in his hair and mud on both boots and by the cat at his heels, 6 years old and already carrying himself with the particular quiet assurance of a child who knows he is exactly where he belongs. "Is it done?" Tom asked, looking at the empty field. "For this year," Calvin said. "Good," said Tom, in exactly the tone his father used when something was complete, and turned and walked back toward the barn with his cat. And Calvin looked at Stella with the full, real smile, the one she had gotten from him in a schoolroom on a November evening and never once stopped being glad to see. And she put her arm around his waist, and they stood there together at the edge of the field while the October light went golden over everything, and the world was complete, and the grief was not gone. It was never fully gone, but it had found its right size and its right place inside a life large enough to hold it alongside joy. And that was what healing looked like, not the removal of sorrow but the expansion of the living that surrounded it, the patient steady growth of everything else. They walked back to the house together in the late afternoon, hand in hand, with the smell of the harvest in the air, and the sound of Anna's voice from the porch where she had been set up with her blocks while Clara Mendes, who had become a regular presence, minded her for the afternoon. Anna regarded her parents' approach with the assessing gaze of a 2-year-old who finds most things require evaluation, and then decided they were acceptable and reached up to be lifted. And Calvin took her, and settled her in the crook of his arm, and she immediately put her hand on his face in the gesture she had learned from her mother, and he leaned into it and smiled at his daughter, and Stella, watching them, stood very still for a moment in the last of the October light with her heart entirely full. This was what she had known that first morning in the store, when she had seen a man carrying something invisible and terrible and looked at him long enough to understand it. She had known, in the particular way that sometimes you simply know, that whatever was happening in that man, whatever he was carrying, it was worth looking at, worth staying near, worth every slow and careful Thursday evening, every silence held without filling, every choice to let him find his own way toward the living while she simply stood close enough that he could find her when he got there. She crossed the porch and went inside, and Calvin followed with Anna, and Tom came in from the barn shedding his boots at the door as instructed, and she put water on for coffee, and Calvin sat at the kitchen table with Anna on his knee and the ledger open beside them, and Tom climbed up on his bench and began working on a drawing of the barn cat with considerable seriousness. And the house settled into the warm, ordinary evening, with the particular quality that ordinary evenings have when you have been paying close enough attention to know what they are worth. Later, when the children were in their beds, Tom under the quilt she had made him for his last birthday and Anna in the carved star bed that Calvin had built for a child who had arrived before her, Stella stood in the doorway of Anna's room for a moment and looked at the 47 stars in the headboard, lit softly by the lamp in the hall. Calvin came and stood beside her. 47, she said softly. I know, he said. You have counted them more than I have. Many more, he said. She looked at the sleeping girl, dark-haired like her father, determined like both of them, named for a woman who had wanted a place with enough sky, and whose name had been carried forward into new love without diminishment. This is a good life, Stella said. It is the best life, Calvin said, and took her hand in the doorway, and they stayed there a moment longer before drawing the door quietly to and going down the hall to their room, where the window faced south, and on clear nights you could see stars of your own, real ones, uncountable, spreading east and west above the Texas plains with the impartial generosity of the sky, which gives its light equally to the grieving and the healed and everyone in between who is working their way from one toward the other. Outside, the Easton place settled into the night, the barn sound under its new roof, the fields at rest, the gazebo standing in its circle of late September blooms now gone to seed for winter. The cattle moved in the dark, their low collective presence a sound that had come to mean safety, steadiness, the ongoing proof that things built with patience and maintained with care do not easily fall. And in the house on the south road outside of Harlan Creek, a man who had ridden into town carrying a grief nobody could see, and a woman who had seen it the first day, and never once made it worse, lay side by side in the quiet of a November night, each breathing the even breath of those at peace, their children asleep down the hall, the work of building something together done for today and waiting to be continued tomorrow, and the stars above Texas going on and on without end, exactly as they always had. Exactly as they would continue to do long after every story told under them was finished.